Derek, and welcome back to Fun Scale Models. This series focusing on building the Park Flyer P-40C Tomahawk. In this episode, we're continuing covering the model's wings.
The wings are next, and just like the horizontal in the elevator, there is a piece that goes on the inside of the aileron bay as well as the leading edge of the aileron itself. One of the things that I've already done is I've added the wingtip, and that's actually out of order. What I should have done is added this panel in first and then added this one. The reason being is this wingtip light will be covered up. Here you can see that I've pinned the aileron in place, and when I was pinning it, I also did it with the aileron washout jig in place. This will allow it to be in approximately the correct position when covering. When we do the covering, you'll want to sort of set it temporarily in place, and then before you finalize it, lay it flat on the washout jig. Again, we're going to cover it with the aileron in place. One of the things that I'll do is I'll use the Easy Dope to get in here. So I'll make sure that when I'm brushing on my Easy Dope, I'm applying it heavily in here. Again, the reason being is I'll be cutting along this line later to cut the aileron free. I'll pull it out. I'll put a little bit of more glue on it to lay that flat against the aileron as well as the trailing edge here. One bit of note before I cut out the panel here. As you can see that there's still tissue on this end and on this end. I recommend not trimming this end off until you've had a chance to set it on the model. So go ahead and trim here, and this edge. Leave this X overhang to start with. Then later you can trim it as needed. So I have the panel about ready to attach. You can see here I made a little bit of a notch so that the stringer comes through. You also want to use the tick marks here as well as the panel lines to align up the panel. I've also made some marks here. You can see right there and right there. And I've added some tick marks to the tissue itself. Now this is excess tissue will be trimmed away once it's covered, but it does give you a good lineup. The other thing to take in consideration is the marks here for the aileron. So you want to make sure that when you're moving it this direction, you can look through light to see it shining through to make sure you get the alignment. And that's why I put these ticks here so I can make sure that my alignment's spot on. I'll go ahead and I'll attach the panel.
And here is the bottom covered wing. You can see there's a pretty good amount of overlap on the leading edge here, which is fine, and the trailing edge is very tight and just slightly overlaps the top. We'll go ahead and we'll let this dry, shrink it up, and we'll add the other side.
All right, so we have both halves of the bottom of the wing covered. Want to give that a really good amount of time to thoroughly dry before you attempt to shrink it, and then we can work on to the top. So I have the top of the right wing panel covered, including the wingtip. When working around the tip, I suggest making a bunch of little cuts to make it lie down much more smoothly and flatter. One of the things I also did was I made sure that when I was sort of finalizing the gluing of the tissue down, that I used the washout jig to already sort of pre-cover it with the washout in. And then I've been very carefully using misting water to shrink this up and tighten it up. Next will be the other panel. And here is the fully covered wing. I've already pre-shrank it and sealed it with the Krylon spray. A couple of things to point out. There is, you can see some wrinkles in this area here and some back here. That's okay. This is the wing center section, and probably a good portion of this is going to be cut out anyways to get access to the elevator and aileron servos and the rudder servo. The other thing to think about that I noticed is you can see a little bit of some lines here. That's actually the balsa shining through. When I covered this panel, because of the dihedral, there was a bit of bunching up and some wrinkles. That's what actually caused this wrinkle right here. So what I did was I made sure that I put a lot of the glue stick glue on these two ribs here and tightened it down to this rib. Then I slit the tissue right here so that it would lay more flat. Wasn't such a big deal on the underside, but on the upper side it did seem to cause a little bit of bunching. So when you do yours, something to consider. The other thing you could do also would be carefully trim the tissue along the line here and then add this as a separate piece. Overall, pretty happy. The next thing will be to carefully cut out the ailerons. Once I do that, then I might be able to tighten up any other little small wrinkles in these areas, as well as gluing the tissue down to the leading edge of the aileron, and then making sure that the aileron bay is also sealed. So in preparation for cutting the aileron free, I made a couple of pin marks through the tissue. Might be a bit difficult to see on camera. But basically what I did is I held this up to a bright light to see the structure underneath and marked them with a pin. I was actually quite happy on how close I was to the actual line for reference on this. I'll use a straight edge and cut the aileron free. And here's the aileron cut free. It's pretty close to the edge here. One thing I've noticed, there's a little bit of lift. That's okay. I'll use the tissue paste or the deluxe tissue covering material to glue that back down. Same with the aileron itself. You can see there is a little bit of lift. That's not a problem. Again, we'll use that glue and go ahead and make sure that it forms nicely around the leading edge. So I've hinged and glued the ailerons in place. Decent amount of travel. I've also cut open the little area here for the control horn on the servo, as well as the spot where we're going to mount the control horn here. I've opened up the bays that we had previously blocked off for the servos and mounted them. So I have both the elevator and the rudder and the elevator servos here. I was able to sort of snake the wires through and have them come out in one spot here, which works really nice and tidy. And they will mount into the fuselage through a small hole that I've marked there. Next, I will be mounting the wing to the fuselage. This, you really want to take your time, do your measurements, make sure that everything is as close to being dead on as possible. And by that I mean the wing tips are the same distance above the ground, as well as the fuselage is as vertical as it can be. Slight imperfections are fine. You can always adjust that out with trim, but the best you can do is always very helpful in making a true flying airplane. So the wing has now been attached to the fuselage. You can see here, I'm pretty happy with the alignment overall. One trick that you can do to make sure that your wing isn't turned this way or that way in comparison is to measure from a point on the tail to a point on the wing. So I did the center of the tail here to this tip of the aileron right there. Did it on both sides using a scrap stringer just to make sure that they're exactly the same distance. I also looked down from the front to make sure that the fuselage wasn't sitting at an angle this way or like that. The next will be to attach the horizontal. So we want to make sure that it's level this direction, and I'm going to make it in reference to the wing itself. We also want to make sure that it's the correct alignment this direction. So I've got the belly pan here covered. This is, of course, the forward section. I've made sure that I've left myself a decent amount of overhang on the bottom. That's going to be flared out and help close the seal, if you will, if it's not an imperfect match up against the bottom of the fuselage, so it'll blend in seamlessly. I also here have the rear section that I've covered separately. I'm going to trim this up, but the same thing, I'm going to leave about 1/8 of an inch to flare out. Here I have the machine gun basically covers or tubes. I've beveled the angle here at the front. You can sort of see there, just with a piece of sandpaper, so that it'll sit more vertical versus at an angle on the nose. The other thing that I did was, if you look at this one here, the gun barrel itself is, 3/32 wide, but it's square and it ends up being sort of a rectangular shape. I took a brass tube that I had sharpened the tip on. It's actually this tip. I don't know if you can see that in there. And just carefully went down the center of the gun barrel, and I'll do that now. And I'm just carefully letting it go to that stop point. All right. And then with an X-Acto, just carefully trim that off. And it's sort of kind of difficult to see due to the charring from the laser, but it's pretty close to being circular. Paint it black and it'll look like a gun barrel. So here you can see I've added the belly pan. Went on pretty straightforward. I used PVA glue, and I use it in this needle tip applicator. Works really good. You can get very precise with it. And I think just sometimes add a little bit of water to help thin that down as needed. A couple tools that I found work really well when applying a part like this. Put it down, and then you can use a paintbrush to sort of gently crease in the tissue. Also, I've found that just basically a popsicle stick works really well to kind of get in those grooves. I've also mounted the intake and the gun pods. So those went on pretty much the same way as the belly pan, using PVA to mount them. Worked really, really well. I'm working on the wing fillets bottom. There's a couple of balsa parts that come with the design. This is the wing fillet piece. One thing that you'll want to do is the edge, and it goes like this. The edge that hits the surface here, you want to bevel that, as well as what would be the top outside edge right here. That will also want to be beveled. So this gets glued on to the back of the wing and also to this stringer here, this main stringer. And then from there is cardstock wing fillets that get glued into place. The cardstock you'll have to work with and trim, check it before finally gluing into place. One thing that I found is, depending on how your printer and how dark this gray is on the wing, you may want to repaint the color of your wing fillets, at least on the bottom. I've found that while I had originally designed the model to have this gray be the same gray that's printed for the cardstock comes through a bit darker, so a lighter gray is fine. I'm actually using this flat gull gray by Testers. It's water wash up acrylic. Works really good. And oddly enough, I think some of the brush strokes help to create sort of the same modeled pattern that you'll get here on the tissue. I'll go about getting those installed next.